I was writing leaders around the time of the 2008 financial crisis, increasingly writing about economics, finance, all these areas, and I thought this is an area which I really want to specialise in.
Let's focus on this particular issue that you and I have been talking about a lot in recent days around the presentation of economics and economic analysis through the media. We've had this report last weekend put out on the BBC website as their big story, proclaiming a fantastic vista if we go for a hard Brexit. And you've really taken that on. And tell me about how you've engaged with that as a journalist.
The research you're referring to is produced by Patrick Minford, who we believe is at Cardiff Business School, and yes, he presents he and his colleagues have presented a wonderful vista of what would happen if we had a hard Brexit. So we didn't stay in the single market, we didn't stay in the customs union, and we essentially crashed out, and they're saying that would be good for the economy. What's frustrating, I know, for the profession is that this outlier study, which they've repeatedly found lots of flaws in lots of different dimensions, was given such prominence on the BBC website, and subsequently the next day was on the flagship radio programme on the BBC as well, the Today programme. What they regard as non-credible research was being given the sort of the bells and whistles and the red carpet, whereas their own research, which is in their view, and my view as well, much higher quality and much more representative of the general profession's view about what the implications of a, quote, hard Brexit would be, is essentially not given that prominence. And the way it was presented, specifically in the Today programme, was here's one view, here's another view. Audience, listeners, you go and make your own mind up. Which one do you find more convincing? And my great fear is that the typical BBC audience member would hear this the way that it's presented and not be able to grasp all the complexities and the jargon, which inevitably there is some jargon, and come away with the impression that the economics profession is split on this question of whether a hard Brexit would be good for the economy or not. And I think that's unfair to the listener, and it's unfair for the BBC to give the listener that impression. I'm certainly not saying he shouldn't be allowed to publish it. What I'm saying is it has to be treated in a very specific way by the BBC. They need to present it, if they are going to feature it, as an outlier. They need to make that clear from the start, and they need to give a real sense that this is not what the profession as a whole believes.
And what's your impression of why this is happening? I mean, we have a very split media. We have some very strong opinions expressed, particularly in newspapers and print journalism and online. Our broadcast media tends to try and be more even-handed, but you're saying that's the big problem here.
There has been some suggestions in response to my article that this is a sort of BBC plot to be working for the government to help achieve what Theresa May wants, which is a hard Brexit, and it's essentially the national broadcaster doing what the government of the day wants. Now, I don't agree with that. I don't believe that's what's going on. I think it's much more likely that the BBC is blundered into this situation because through a combination of sort of laziness and political cowardice. The laziness is essentially saying, well, let's not properly research these issues. Let's just say, oh, look, here's a press release from, say, the Patrick Minford team saying this. Let's get someone else saying something else, and we'll have a nice ding-dong battle between the two sides. That's good entertainment. That's all we need to do. I think that's a lazy way of reporting scientific research, particularly on a very, very important issue for the country's future and lots of living standards of most people in the country. That's lazy. The political cowardice side would be the fact that they are very keen to represent, because it is so one-sided, the economic debate, and because there are powerful vested interests in delivering a hard Brexit, they don't want to be accused of favouring one side or the other. And so therefore they are more inclined to take pro-Brexit economic research simply to cover their backs, essentially. This is my suspicion, to cover their backs, and that's why they did it in that way. But again, it's wrong to be lazy, it's also wrong to be politically cowardly, because the BBC should have the courage and the competence and the intellectual rigour to make an editorial decision based on where the evidence points them, not where it makes life easier for the producers and the reporters of the BBC.
You've responded very vigorously to this, as have some of the research institutes that have done work on this issue, who understand something about trade economics. But how do you think the profession as a whole should respond?
I think the important thing is voice, and the profession needs a medium or a funnel, if you like, or a channel through which its voice can be distilled and then projected out to organisations like the BBC, like the Independent, you name it, the whole media. That's not to say that the profession needs to speak with a single voice and that they can only have one opinion, and if they haven't got that opinion, they're somehow not part of the profession or the academy. I think trade is a very good example. Brexit and trade is a very good example where there is a clear consensus, and it's such an important political topic, obviously, because of Brexit. That's a clear example where they can speak with a clear voice, and they should band together and make that clear to broadcasters. This is where the opinion lies, and I think that would make the broadcasters and the reporters and journalists in general think. Now, I've spoken about powerful vested interests already. There are obviously newspapers where they are not, who are very pro-Brexit because their owners are very pro-Brexit, where that kind of anti-Brexit, if you like, research, perceived to be anti-Brexit, would not get a good showing. Now, leave that on one side. For the rest of the media, particularly the BBC, I think the profession speaking with a single voice would have an effect. Maybe not immediately, but over time. And I think the economics profession could learn from the climate science community, who faced a similar issue with sort of false balance at the BBC over climate science, where the producers would perpetually try and set up a ding-dong battle with two opinions, which was wrong and unfair to readers. I think those climate scientists put pressure on the BBC, and I think they changed the BBC's internal guidelines so that they would not treat climate change in that false balanced way. I think there's scope for economists, academic economists, to get the BBC to take a similar look again at the way it handles things like Brexit trade economics.
There have been some discussion around the difference between balance and fairness. You talk about balance being the thing that BBC pursues, and then you and I really interpret that as false balance.
Yeah.
But there's something about fairness. What can we learn there from the climate scientists and perhaps other natural scientists and how they tackle this issue?
Yeah, I think
it's important to distinguish the two. Balance would see, on a naive level, balance is simply having one person on one side and one person on the other. But if you think about the BBC from a public service perspective, its responsibility is to be fair to its viewers, and that doesn't necessarily mean setting them up with a Punch and Judy debate. If that debate, that Punch and Judy show, does not reflect the balance of opinion within the profession within a scientific profession on a particular issue, I think that's how I would describe that as false balance, and false balance is unfair to the viewers. Now, what you need at the BBC is producers and journalists who are prepared to push aside the political pressure to prevent that, to show that false balance, and who have the courage to say, no, we're going to be fair to our readers, and if we get political flack for being fair to our readers, we will face it down on that basis.
It seems to me there's a sort of distinction between people who are writing as economic journalists who've got a background in economics, often a master's or a DPhil, they've come out of a top research institution, and other journalists who maybe haven't, like yourself, who've studied another subject, maybe a related subject.
Yeah.
What can the profession do to sort of help inform the journalists a little bit more about what the principles of the subject are, what it's all about, what the areas are where there's really consensus on findings and analysis? In a way that's not patronising to the media, I guess.
No, well, I think one should never be afraid to be patronising, actually. That's quite a good lesson, I would say, is that don't feel that you're dumbing things down, because journalists love things which are dumbed down, because don't forget, the journalist is never likely to take offence themselves, but it helps them because they are trying to communicate, most of them, trying to get to a very, very broad audience. I mean, they're going to have to do a lot of translation anyway, in all likelihood. So if you actually help them get there, as a scientist, as an economist, most journalists I know would only be too happy to have that. I mean, the danger is not dumbing down. The danger is that the scientists and the economists put out research which is still too jargon heavy, which still doesn't actually simplify enough, and still doesn't very clearly link the findings and the implications. Clarity, simplicity, within obviously the bounds of being scientifically rigorous, is what I would urge economists, all economists and scientists to strive for.
Finally, I've worked with economists over a number of years trying to help them communicate their research to the wider world, but I've primarily tended to focus on the media, getting journalists like yourself to pick up a story and write about it, to get an economist to appear on the Today programme or Newsnight talking about their research. In these dark times of Brexit and Trump, it seems like it's actually now an issue that we need to push beyond that. We need to inform a general public, and a genuinely general public of people who aren't necessarily reading these newspapers, aren't watching these programs. Any thoughts on what we could be doing there?
Well, I would say to economists who want to get their message out and who are invited to get onto news media programs to get them out, to do it. Do not pass up an opportunity to speak about the value of your work and the value of the profession's work and its relevance to people's ordinary lives. People are interested in economics, they're interested in living standards, they're interested in the economy, they're interested in the futures of themselves and their children. And economists have a lot to say about that, and useful things to say. And they should certainly not shy away from the media limelight saying, oh, it's too dumbed down, or my message will be distorted. Use it, use the opportunity, seize it, because otherwise you're going to get things like we saw with the BBC, where minor, flawed research gets the spotlight and your own work, which is good, detailed and important, gets pushed to one side.